as you know, we need to give the, yes, we can start to our technician for the live streaming. So, but I think that we are all here and we can go.
Okay.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to extend to all of you my warmest welcome to the final conference of the Horizon 2020 DETECT project. I would like to thank all the participants for their essential contribution to the success of this conference. And my special thanks go to the organizing team who have worked hard to ensure that we all had an enjoyable and engaging experience. I'm very sorry that we could not host you all in person here in Rome on this first day of summer. As you can imagine, the organizing process began many months ago when we were still dealing with the pandemic emergency in our everyday life. So the decision to move the conference online was very difficult, but necessary. However, I'm very happy to see that things are now improving for all of us, and I truly hope that we will be back to meet in person very soon. In the meantime, I wish everyone to enjoy the conference. Over the next days, we will continue to post news and updates about this event on the DETECT social media accounts. So please feel free to interact, repost and share your experience using the hashtag DETECT 2021. And now I'm pleased to give the floor to Professor Nicola Ferrigni, who will extend to you the greetings from the entire Link Campus University community. Professor Ferrigni is head of the Link Lab Research Center, the research center here at Link Campus, which has hosted the DETECT project for the last 3 years. So, Nicola, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Valentina. Are you hearing me well? Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you today to open the final conference of the DETECT project funded by the European Union in the framework of the Horizon 2020 program. As a director of Link Lab, the Social Research Center of Link Campus University, I felt very honored to take part in the DETECT project. Indeed, the goal of DETECT blends with the mission of Link Lab. In fact, through the use of cultural products like the crime narratives, it aims to investigate relevant changes in social perception, in relations, representations, as well as to study the process of construction of the European cultural identity. My cordial greeting to all participants, and a special thanks to Professor Monica Dalasta of the University of Bologna, project coordinator, Professor Giulia Carluccio, Vice Chancellor of the University of Torino and the President of the Consulta Universitaria del Cinema, Professor Roberta Bartoletti of the University of Urbino Carlo Bo and President of the Associazione Italiana di Sociologia, Sezione Processi e Istituzioni Culturali, and Professor Valentina Re, Communication Manager of the DETECT project. Despite the restrictions imposed by COVID when I looked through the conference program, I saw major international event with a high scientific profile with 3 eminent keynote speakers, over 80 speakers, a panel on European policies to support the media sector and the creative economy, a round table on the social impact of academic research in the humanities, and finally, the award ceremony of a screenwriting contest that has attracted the participation of 250 young authors from all over Europe, whose winner will be awarded by a jury of international excellence in the audiovisual field, chaired by the Italian writer Maurizio De Giovanni. I also would like to extend my thanks to the team that organized this impressive event, which involved the faculty, students, and the staff of Link Campus University, working in close cooperation with the other Italian universities involved in the project, the University of Bologna and the Gabriele D'Annunzio University of Chieti Pescara. The text shows the importance of research in the fields of popular culture, film, television, media, and literature. The text has made possible an effective dialogue between the humanities, digital humanities, social sciences, and stakeholders in cultural and creative industries. The text also shows the strategic relationship between research and teaching. I renew my warmest welcome to you with great pleasure, and so please enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for your very kind words. Okay, now you can see me, and as Nicola mentioned, 2 important Italian scholarly associations have supported this conference. And the first I would like to mention again is the Associazione Italiana di Sociologia, sezione Processi e Istituzioni Culturali. And again, it's a great pleasure to give the floor to its president, Professor Roberta Bartoletti, from the University of Urbino Carlo Bo. Please, Professor Bartoletti, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Many thanks for inviting me to this conference. I'm very pleased to bring the best wishes of the scholars of cultural studies of the Italian Sociological Association to this conference, an event at which so many colleagues from multiple fields of media studies, cultural studies, social science are participating. The study of different contemporary forms of popular culture can only benefit from a multidisciplinary approach, such as that proposed by this conference. We all know how important stories can be, and particularly those told by the media. And we know also that experience of audience is very important and should be taken seriously. Crime narrative produce profound critical vision of current society and should also be taken seriously. I mean, as a cultural sociologist, I believe that the study of crime narratives in print and screen media is vital when attempting to understand cultural identities, dominant narratives, and controversial topics. And European identities represent a critical issue, sure, and cultural studies can contribute significantly to exploring the contradiction, ambivalence, which characterize our way of living in Europe and to feel European. Another strength of this event is to examine the differences and the complex processes of the transnational spread of media stories, characterized by hybridization and indigenization. We are aware that we need to highlight differences between national context, production and consumption of media narratives. Finally, I will be brief, but I must admit that I have been a passionate reader of crime stories since I was a child, and I was delighted to see so many sessions about national authors, French, not just British or Nordic author and production that I have enjoyed both as a consumer, at first as a consumer, and then as a scholar. I regret because I won't be able to follow everything, but I hope that the research being presented here over the next few days will be soon published, and that the scientific community will be able to enjoy it. Thank you so very much for this work. So thanks again for having organized this conference. I would like to finish by wishing a good work and a good discussion to everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Professor Bartoletti. I'm sorry because we had a problem with your camera. So during your speech, there was my face. But if you want to turn on your camera now, maybe all the people can see you.
Yes, I'm sorry because my camera is on now. Okay. Now.
Okay. So okay.
I was
okay. Okay. Thank you. I thought it was nice that people could also see you. Thank you for your passionate words. And now the second association is the Consulta Universitaria del Cinema, the Italian Association of Film and Media Study Scholars. The president, Professor Giulia Carluccio, who is a Vice Chancellor of the University of Turin, could not join us today, but we are glad to be able to show at least a video message she has sent to all the participants. So I think that now we can watch the clip.
Good morning to everyone, to the speakers, to the audience, and of course to the conference chairs, Monica Dalasta, Federico Pagello, Valentina Re, and also to the organizing committee, Luca Antoniazzi, Sara Casoli, Massimiliano Coviello, Paola De Rosa, Lorenzo Orlando, whom I salute for organizing such an important conference. I'm very glad to be sending the greetings on behalf of the Consulta Universitaria del Cinema in this final conference dedicated to detecting Europe in contemporary crime narratives, print fiction, film, and television. Today is the finishing line of a long research path that has involved the participation of a network of universities, television programs, archives, within the context of the Horizon 2020 project, detecting transcultural identity in European popular crime narrative, coordinated by Monica Dalasta from Bologna University. A research that intends to see, within the study of popular culture, the possibility to seize the social, political, and historical conflicts and contradictions that characterize contemporary European societies today. The conference program and today's and tomorrow's panels will allow us to interrogate the concept of Europeanness as a critical category and to explore the scope and limits of the interrelated notions of transnational identity and cosmopolitanism when applied to the works of European crime fiction, providing us also with a methodology that bridges the cultural history applied to film and media studies with new perspective for research. I thank you very much, and I wish everyone a good work. Sadly, I cannot be there with you today, as I'm receiving my second dose of COVID vaccine. I so much wish that we will soon be able to meet again in person.
Okay, so it was nice to hear the kind words of Professor Giulia Carluccio. But now it is finally time to get into the details of the DETECT project. I am therefore particularly pleased to introduce the project coordinator, Professor Monica Dalasta from the University of Bologna. So Monica, the screen is yours now.
Okay. So yes, Valentina, thank you. At last, here we are, almost at the end of a long and complex journey, which has provided us with an extraordinary opportunity to make a truly exciting transcultural research experience. I also have many people to thank for their dedication to the project. And first of all, of course, I need to really thank you, Valentina, and your fantastic team for mounting the complex machine behind the organization, not only of this conference, but also of the whole communication of the project. This was very hard work, and the results are obvious in both the quality and the quantity of what is forthcoming in these next extremely dense days. I also want to thank Federico Pagello, our co-chair, for the invaluable help he has provided throughout all the past 39 months and even before, during the elaboration of the project's proposal, constantly assisting me through all the challenges, and there were many, we had to face during this time, always dispensing the wealth of his critical thinking at each stage of this journey. And I have to thank my colleague Ilaria Bartolini, our ICT coordinator, for providing the information infrastructure that has allowed the consortium to experiment with new research methods and tools, providing the framework for a productive conversation between humanistic research and digital technologies. But above all, I have to thank the entire community of DETECT researchers. Working with so many colleagues from so many different countries and disciplines has been incredibly challenging, but also incredibly rewarding in terms of transcultural learning and innovation of our research perspectives. Each one of us has been exposed to such a multiplicity of points of view, research methodologies, and outputs that attempting a synthesis of the project's results is definitely not an easy task. We started DETECT with a prospect of about 40 articles to be published during the project's life. We now have more than 80 already published or in press, and no doubt more will be on the way after this conference. A proper synthesis of all this work will certainly need more time and more collective effort. Although several panels and papers in this conference will already start to do the job. In this short talk, I will then try to make just a few preliminary observations about some of DETECT's results that will be further discussed throughout the conference panels and hopefully in further work following the project itself. So, what have we learned from these 3 years of research about the transculturality of the European contemporary crime genre? To try and answer this question, we need to go back to our initial hypothesis and confront them with our results. In so doing, I will refer exclusively to what we can call the pure research strengths of the project, which is an important thing to be noted, for in fact, the text also involves aspects of applied research, such as, for example, our experimentation in the field of innovative learning methodologies, which are not covered in this conference, as well as applications in the field of cultural tourism and digital humanities, which will be discussed in a couple of the forthcoming panels. So what were our initial hypotheses and what have we learned from the research? First of all, we assumed that during the whole period starting in 1989, the crime genre has increasingly worked as a driver for narrative delocalization. In other words, we wanted to investigate the part played by the narrative devices of crime fiction in the multiplication of stories set in the remotest localities of the European continent. Secondly, we wanted to study what this movement toward the delocalization of a traditionally urban and even metropolitan narrative structure across a myriad of peripheral localities could mean with regard to the transformation of cultural identities in the context of global economy and circulation. More specifically, we asked whether the re-territorialization of crime fiction on peripheral localities, now portrayed as the centers of universal dramas, could help foster the maturation of a transcultural European identity, promoting reciprocal knowledge among transnational audiences. The study of the genre had then to take into consideration different aspects, ranging from issues of representation, asking, for example, whether the emphasis on locality is complemented by the adoption of transcultural themes and figures or international aesthetic styles, to issues of production, interrogating the different production cultures emerging across the continent and the extent to which their projects involve transnational cooperation and or collaboration among different media, to issues of distribution and reception, studying the extent to which these localized narratives actually manage to travel across the continent and which response they elicit from the audience. On the level of representation, we definitely found the emergence of a kind of a transcultural koine in contemporary European crime narratives, based on what a few of us have called the noirification of the crime genre. This is, of course, a more general trend across the world, but the way in which this process has developed in Europe is no doubt peculiar. On the one hand, it is no doubt true that this process of noirification has occurred through the appropriation of the stylistic features of American noir, be it by re-semanticizing specific noir literary models, a process of going since at least the 1970s, or by adapting the aesthetics and sometimes the mode of production of American quality TV in the field of television seriality. On the other hand, however, the noirification of the European crime genre has drawn profoundly on local, especially literary traditions, creating distinct regional or macro-regional approaches. Both the cases of Nordic Noir and Mediterranean Noir are emblematic examples of how contemporary trends in European crime storytelling emerge at the intersection of several media, with film, but especially television, drawing largely on the multiple rich traditions of European regional noir literatures. There are good reasons to look at these two major strands of European noir as distinct, if certainly interconnected, transcultural identities. Nordic and Mediterranean noir works are made distinguishable by their use of two different sets of stylistic and thematic features, ranging from their different imagery of color and light to the narrative role played by their geographical setting, the historical events, and the current socio-political issues that are often evoked in the stories. Their transculturality is proved not only by the fact that these narrative styles are practiced beyond the borders of single nations, but also by how easily they are adopted and adapted even beyond their supranational areas of origin. Nordic Noir is no doubt the most emblematic case in point. Starting the process of its circulation across and beyond Europe has shown a variety of appropriations in different regions, testified by the emergence of paradoxical labels such as Belgian or Hungarian Nordic Noir. While the success of Nordic Noir is a striking case in terms of the transcultural circulation of its aesthetic styles and narrative tropes, definitely a result of the long tradition of cultural cooperation and economic exchange across the region, the transculturality of Mediterranean noir is much more complex to articulate, for it exposes a number of geopolitical contradictions that cannot be ignored when talking about the conundrum that we evoke every time that we pronounce the phrase European identity. Although the label Mediterranean noir did emerge sometime before Nordic Noir's fortunate debut on the international scene, and more precisely during the decade that reshaped the face of Europe following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, its cultural as well as economic significance is nowhere close to having achieved the popularity of its Nordic counterpart. Understanding the reasons for the underperformance of Mediterranean noir as compared to Nordic noir brings forward a few unsolved issues in the process of European integration. Unlike Nordic noir, which appeared as the result of a well-defined marketing strategies, the notion of Mediterranean noir was introduced during the 90s as the name of a collective poetics advanced by a group of southern French, Spanish, Greek, and Italian writers willing to use the popular appeal and investigative potential of crime fiction to deliver a scathing political critique of the functioning of modern liberal democracies. Their notion of the Mediterranean as a driver of transcultural exchange was not intended just as a mere cosmopolitan celebration of the richness of diversity, but also as a contradictory metaphor of the violence that increasingly characterizes contemporary transnational relations in the age of globalization, the entanglement of political power and organized crime, corruption, the violation of human rights, and so on. While the label Mediterranean noir was rapidly attributed to the works of a number of South Mediterranean writers in Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and elsewhere, the attempt to create a real sphere of transcultural dialogue among these authors and their audiences was inevitably doomed to collapse under the complete failure of all the objectives stated in the 1995 Barcelona Declaration in the occasion of the Euro-Mediterranean Conference, which promised to work, quote, to turn the Mediterranean basin into an area of dialogue, exchange, cooperation, peace, stability, and prosperity, end of quote. Similarly, the failure to build a policy of solidarity among South European countries nowhere made more evident than in the abandonment of Greece to the by now widely disparaged European imposition of austerity measures in the wake of the 2008-2009 crisis, has further weakened the cultural bonds that could have sustained the development of cooperative projects. Just as the notion of the Mediterranean as a dynamic, polycentric site of cooperation has sunk into an abysmal reality of wars, human rights violations, neo-colonial interests, and selfish privilege, the name of Mediterranean noir has survived almost only as the specter of its utopian project, declared dead by its own proponents or reduced to merely serve the purposes of the tourism economy. In the meanwhile, while the larger countries with a stronger crime fiction tradition, France, Germany, and of course the UK, keep on producing large quantities of noir and detective novels, films, and TV dramas, the East European area struggles to add its voices to the mosaic. Whereas the last 3 decades have seen the crime genre acquire cultural prestige and legitimation almost everywhere across Europe, this development appears to have been particularly slow in the Eastern region. Despite the emergence of a few extremely original crime authors, a traditional consideration of crime stories as a lower genre in terms of cultural prestige, in addition to the weaker industrial structure of these characteristically small cultural markets, has left an open field for the installation of American operations working at once as producers and digital distributors of original audiovisual content. While Netflix operates all across Europe and HBO has another branch in the Nordic region, the weight of these two American giants in Eastern Europe is no doubt much more relevant and speaks tons about the insufficient policy measures adopted so far by the EU to promote the expression of cultural diversity, particularly in regard to the situation of the smaller markets. As our panel on policy issues will discuss next Wednesday, even the new Audiovisual Media Service Directive approved in 2018, despite many improvements and a lot of goodwill, does not seem to provide the means for a radical transformation of the state of the art. In fact, although it is undeniable that OTT and VOD platforms have both promoted local production and local talent and provided the digital infrastructure for the circulation and dissemination of peripherally produced audiovisual content, recent data about the catalog composition on these channels shows the persistence of a logic of cultural proximity, with only a small share of non-national or proximate products available at any given time in different regions. Furthermore, at the exception of a very few cases, the most innovative products of European noir quality television do not seem to be able to really reach a pan-European mass audience. In other words, European noir quality television still struggles to compete with the popularity of American crime shows, which is only contended on domestic markets by a few very traditional national products primarily meant for domestic consumption. This marks a significant difference with the literary market, where translation trends show a relatively greater openness towards the discovery of non-national authors, so that we can say that within the literary market, both Nordic and Mediterranean noir can legitimately be considered as pan-European cultural phenomena. Of course, figures for best-selling novels are hardly comparable with the figures for television audiences, but print crime fiction has had an enormous role in Europe in shaping the form of the genre as a transcultural phenomenon. This is one of the primary characteristics that make up the specificity of the European crime genre as compared to what we can observe in the US. A remarkably large and possibly growing number of popular European crime television dramas actually originate as transpositions from the page to the screen. Clearly, this reflects systemic differences in the functioning of the European creative industries as compared to the US, which include aspects like the polycentric organization of production and the audience fragmentation according to their languages, that all refer back to the extraordinary diversity of the European cultures. No doubt, in Europe, the distinction between a writer and a screenwriter is less marked than in the US. And we have many examples of renowned novelists who have become directly involved in the adaptation of their works for the screen. This also makes a difference in the type of content that is brought to the screens. While it is hard to generalize, at least since the inception of neopolar in the 1970s, European noir fiction has been at the forefront of an approach aimed to put the entertainment value of detective plots at the service of social and political critique. In many cases, this penchant for a kind of socio-political detection has produced powerful explorations into the most obscure and troubling pages of European history, with stories dealing with the horrors of fascism, Nazism, Francoism, colonialism, military occupation, the totalitarian policy of real socialism, and so on. These themes have found their way onto the screens, contributing to renew the memory of Europe's conflicted past among the younger generations. In general, with its diversity and profoundly critical inspiration, European crime fiction definitely represents an extraordinarily rich reservoir of inspiration for audiovisual crime productions and is playing a significant role in the building of a European model of crime quality television. Finally, it is important to note that while most of European fictional detectives are still portrayed as white cisgender males, there has been a significant move forward towards a more diversified representation of the heroes and ever more often the heroines' identities. Not only we have recently witnessed a real explosion of female sleuths in both print and screen fiction, but more than a few works have appeared that focus on the experiences of ethnically diverse detectives, often portrayed as second-generation immigrants, Turkish in Germany, Chinese in Italy, North Africans in France, and so on. There are entire book series focusing on lesbian, queer, and trans detectives, and the trope of the expatriate investigator from another European country has also become fairly common. In addition, European crime seriality has also been at the forefront of a movement that has originated an extraordinary gallery of neurodivergent, mostly female sleuths, eliciting appreciation and a rich debate across the autistic audience and their truly transcultural online communities. As everywhere in the context of popular culture, and particularly on the television screens, stereotypes are always lurking in these products. But it is undeniable that the last 30 years have seen a maturation of the European crime genre's ability to expose the increasing diversity of Europe's cultural geography and its social identities. To go back to our initial hypothesis, that is, whether European crime narratives as a deep localized polycentric genre could help foster the propagation of a transcultural identity, promote reciprocal knowledge, and stimulate a cosmopolitan disposition to difference and diversity among transnational audiences, we may answer that yes. On the level of representation strategies, many clues seem to lead to this conclusion. However, the extreme fragmentation of the media market, the natural obstacles opposed by European multilingualism, and the tendency to follow convenient pathways of proximity in the distribution of cultural products still hinder crime fiction's potential for the dissemination of an expansive transculturality among European audiences. It is then these obstacles that future European policies and possibly new research projects will have to tackle to encourage the cosmopolitan transition that we all deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for your presentation. I think it was such a rich and inspiring overview of the research conducted in the framework of Detect. Sorry, I have a technical problem with my camera. And I guess it was difficult to to put all the research, the tech researches, in a short presentation. But you
just
did
a little
it.
bit. It's just a little bit.
Just an overview, a map. But I think you mentioned many of the topics we are going to discuss over these 3 days of conference. And I think that we will start right now to discuss one of the most challenging topic of the tech, that is the interaction between a local dimension and a global dimension in European crime narratives. And so I think I can give the floor to Professor Andrew Pepper from Queen's University, Belfast. I still don't see Andrew. We are waiting for Andrew to introduce our first keynote speech. Okay. Andrew, can you hear us? I'm afraid we cannot hear Andrew Pepper. Okay, so I think we can stop the live streaming for a moment just to check what is the problem with Andrew. more people from the research, the entire research team. So we are sure that the discussion will be engaging. I mean, we are so interested in the topic. Okay, so I think we can start again with the live streaming. And okay, so I can go. So I'm very glad to and honored to introduce the conference first keynote speaker, Professor Theo, who is Emeritus Professor of English, American, and Comparative Literature at Leuven University and Leiden University. I would also like to remind that he's the author of numerous publications of postmodernism, postcolonialism, popular fiction, and world literature. And next to numerous essays on contemporary crime fiction, he published with Hans Bartens the book Contemporary American Crime Fiction, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2001, and co-edited with David Damrosch and Louis Nilsson, the book Crime Fiction as World Literature, published by Bloomsbury in 2017. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to Professor Theo. Let me just remind the title of his speech, that is, How Glocal Are Contemporary European Crime Narratives. So thank you for being here with us, and the screen is yours.
Thank you. I thank you for your introduction. I also want to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to give this introductory lecture. I also want to congratulate, obviously, all the organizers of the DETECT program. In fact, I scrolled through the book of abstracts for the conference here and realized that I should have been much more hesitant in accepting the invitation to give the keynote speech, because the fare that your conference is offering is so rich that I'm afraid that the only thing I can do is put a couple of scraps on the table for you. My talk is going to be very general. I mean, you kindly referred to a book I did with Hans Bertens in 2001. But of course, in this day and age, 20 years ago is a long time, and things have very much changed, especially with respect to European crime fiction. So what I'm going to do is basically give a very general background with respect to European crime fiction, of course, and its place in world literature. But I've already seen from the abstracts that in the panels and also from the abstracts to the other keynote lectures, that very general background that I'll be sketching is going to be filled out and filled in much more detail and much better than I ever could in the separate talks to follow over the days to come. So bear with me when I seem to be very general. As I say, I'm a little bit bashful now to present what I have. But this is what I have, and here goes. And I hope that at least I will touch upon a few issues that may be of interest, and as I say, that will usefully be picked up in the days to come. In his 1984 biography of T.S. Eliot, Peter Ackroyd tells us that Eliot, in the single year 1927, not only contributed a long piece on the 19th century British author Wilkie Collins to his journal, The Criterion, praising Collins's The Moonstone as the first, longest, and best of modern English detective novels, but that he also reviewed 24 detective novels himself. Now, Ackroyd comments that detective fiction was Eliot's passion. He could quote long passages of Sherlock Holmes from memory. This is one of his party tricks. And in later years, he liked to discuss with friends the work of Georges Simenon and Raymond Chandler. Now, Eliot's interest in detective fiction has received scarce or scant attention in studies of his work. Lyndall Gordon, in her 1998 T.S. Eliot, An Imperfect Life, doesn't mention any one of the detective writers Ackroyd refers to, but does detail how Eliot liked to play Holmes to the Watsons around him. This, Gordon posits, is also the role assigned to the spectator of Eliot's first plays, which she claims were all mysteries of sorts. And just as Watson has to decipher the cryptic utterances of Holmes's that afterwards turn out to have contained the key to the mystery to be solved, so, Gordon argues, the ostensible mysteries constituting the plots of his plays for Eliot only served to veil the true mystery to which each of these plays pointed, and that were interior mysteries, hard to stage and hard to voice. Now, you may wonder why I commence a talk on crime fiction, a broad label, which following John Coelty and his pioneering studies on the genre, I will take to cover detective fiction and crime fiction in the narrow sense, but also the thriller. Now, why I want to start such a talk with a discussion of T.S. Eliot? Well, there's a fairly simple explanation, even beyond Eliot's own little trumpeted enthusiasm for the genre. Just as with respect to Eliot's work, his interest in detective fiction has been little discussed, so too the crime genre for the longest time, of course, was treated with disdain in orthodox literary studies. Deemed fit only for escapist entertainment, it was considered subliterary along with other such so-called formula genres. And just as there is another deeper mystery behind Eliot's surface mystery, so over the last 50 years or so, the realization has dawned that popular literature, precisely because it is popular, next to providing entertainment to a large body of readership, also echoes general feelings and attitudes expressive of a particular time and place. And of no particular genre is this so much the case as of crime fiction. In fact, it has gradually come to be recognized that it's precisely this escapist function that also makes the crime genre socially and even ideologically productive. And let me illustrate this by way of those examples of the genre at which the escapist reproach was leveled to begin with, British Golden Age and American hard-boiled fiction. However, in order to arrive at the point I want to press home, I first have to make a brief detour to the 19th century and Jane Austen. The nation and identity building function of literature has been recognized since the early 19th century with the triumph of what was that century's popular genre, the historical novel a la Walter Scott, and the subsequent enshrinement of national literature canons via the institutionalization of national literature curricula. Especially since the rise of cultural memory studies, the Assmans, Anne Rigney, the Nunnings, Astrid Earle, etc., literary works have increasingly come to be considered as what I would call the verbal equivalents to Pierre Norat's lieux de mémoire. In fact, works of literature often contain or give verbal expression to a real lieu de mémoire in the form of the landscapes, including cityscapes, of course, they describe. As Edward Said argues in Culture and Imperialism, the idea of the parkscape surrounding a grand English mansion in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park at the same time served to hide and unveil the colonial exploitation of the colonies. In the case of Mansfield Park, it is Antigua, where Sir Thomas Bartram owns the sugar plantation that is the source of his wealth, that in the interest of the colonizer is reduced to monoculture and thus bereft of its natural variety. The wealth thus generated allows for the conversion of what had formerly been productive farmland or pastures in England into a park for recreative and aesthetic purposes. What remains more veiled is that such a development had started already with the successive waves of enclosure that had helped drive commoners off lands formerly open to all in common. Ultimately, this process contributed to the pauperization of a sizable portion of the English population, turning them into a willing workforce for nascent industrialization, and thus laying the basis for the rampant proletarization of the 19th century, the London of William Blake and Charles Dickens, in which the common man is little better off than the slave on Antigua. And it's no coincidence, of course, that we trace the origins of modern crime fiction precisely to the turbulent 19th century, and not just in Collins's England. Edgar Allan Poe, not for nothing, made his Auguste Dupin a citizen of Paris. Now, just as Jane Austen's novels did for a particular section of early 19th century British society, the Golden Age British detective novel a la Agatha Christie, and the interbellum American hard-boiled novel created imaginary verbal lieux de mémoire, expressive of subliminal desires and resentments of particular segments of the British and US American populations. The British Golden Age novel in the stately mansions, upper-class apartments, luxury hotels, trains, and cruise ships catering to the wealthy and privileged that form the terrain of Hercule Poirot's investigation, and the rural village that forms the backdrop to Mrs. Marple's sleuthing, sketches an idealized English land and city, but also a socioscape that never actually existed, but that interbellum readers were encouraged to remember as the true England lost in a post-World War I present they experienced as an age of decline. When the order of this imaginary idealized England is disturbed by crime, Christie's Poirot and Mrs. Marple, but also Dorothy Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey, Guy Marsh's Roderick Alleyne, and Marjorie Allingham's Albert Campion restore that order. How all this feeds into a particular idea of Britishness can be seen from how in many of these Golden Age detective novels, the villains are foreigners or members of one or other despised minority, and how the detectives themselves, with the exception of Poirot and Mrs. Marple, are themselves members of, easily rub shoulders with, and draw support from Britain's uppermost classes, with Allingham's Albert Campion in the early novels in which he features even hinted at as being related to the royal family. In a comparable way, the American hard-boiled Private Eye serves as the idealized projection of what the common American man aspires to be, but what he senses he has lost after World War I. During that war, the massive enlistment of prominently or predominantly white American men had led to labor shortages in many sectors. These vacancies had been filled by African Americans moving up from the rural South into the industrialized North, and to a large extent also by women. Upon their return from the war, discharged white soldiers found that employers were reluctant to replace their cheaper African American and female workforce with higher salaried white men. And it is to the resulting feelings of resentment and disenfranchisement that the hard-boiled hero gave expression. He does what Mr. Common America feels powerless to do, to seek some form of justice, but not necessarily to set right a system from which he feels alienated to begin with. Now, given the background I just sketched, it will not come as a surprise that the villain in these novels and stories is most often a foreigner again, and a member of a minority or female. In Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, all three come together in Bridget O'Shaughnessy. But the other villains fit the bill too. Caspar Gutman, the fat man, is British and Jewish. Joel Cairo is the Cypriot and gay. Samuel Spade or Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, on the contrary, are embodiments of the ideal American male. Self-contained, attractive, strong, a smart individual in charge of things. In short, everything the real white man, American male, no longer felt like. Now, T.S. Eliot's well-known, gradually ever more conservative leanings in matters social and political very likely underpinned his interest in detective fiction. After all, only 1 year after his essay and reviews in the Criterion I referred to earlier, he made his famous statement that he was, and I quote, classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. My point so far, then, is that British Golden Age and American hard-boiled fiction in the guise of entertainment at the same time fed their primary domestic readerships an ideal of nation with which to identify. After World War II, as a corollary to the dominant position English came to assume as international lingua franca in the wake of America's emergence as sole Western superpower, English language literature, particularly from Britain and the United States, gained much greater visibility worldwide than before. Before 1940, it can be legitimately argued with Pascal Casanova in her The World Republic of Letters that French literature served as the measuring rod and reference for literature in other languages, even if, as Franco Moretti argues in his Atlas of the European Novel, English literature was a close runner-up, at least when it comes to the 19th century novel. As Casanova herself admits, though, after World War II, English language literature indubitably has assumed the mantle formerly donned by French literature. And the same thing goes for crime fiction and films and later television series. Before World War II, Maurice Leblanc's Arsène Lupin, whose comeback we now celebrate in a serial drama series, which apparently is very successful, this Arsène Lupin would likely have held his own with Christie's Poirot, let alone other British Golden Age sleuths, and this not just in Francophone Europe. The same thing goes for Georges Simenon's Maigret already in the 1930s, but continuing until long after the war. An American hard-boiled crime fiction arguably took root in Europe only with the foundation in 1944 of Gallimard's Série Noire, which initially concentrated on translations of Hammett, Chandler, and the like, but which gradually added French writers working in a similar vein. On the rebound, the label noir, as applied to movies inspired upon these works, such as Ascenseur pour l'échafaud, Louis Malle's 1958 movie based on the eponymous 1956 novel by Noël Calef and starring Maurice René and Jeanne Moreau, along with the haunting theme by Miles Davis, retrospectively also came to designate American hard-boiled fiction itself, along with comparable works in other languages. At least until the early 1970s then, the French tradition in crime fiction and movies remained prominent alongside, and increasingly so, the American. I distinctly remember that the crime and detective movies most often aired on Belgian television from its beginnings in the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, also on the Flemish language channel. We only had one channel at the time, you know, where are the times? Featured the likes of Jean Gabin, Lino Ventura, Alain Delon, and Jean-Paul Belmondo. Be all this as that may, there is no denying that for the post-World War II period, the Anglo-American crime tradition increasingly set the tone. And particularly striking in this respect is Stuart King's remark that, and I'm quoting him now, crime writers from Spain tended to reproduce foreign patterns, as authors reportedly responded to readers' expectations and set their stories abroad in exotic locales and populated their narratives with foreign characters. In many cases, this act of national literary transvestism was completed by the use of foreign, English or faux English pseudonyms with accompanying fictitious English titles from which the novels were supposedly translated into Spanish. Such was the case of Fernanda Cano, who, writing as Mary Frances Cole, wrote 13 novels between 1953 and 1963 in the English cozy tradition. Now, King cites John Coelty, one of the pioneers of the study of crime fiction, as I mentioned before, lamenting as late as 2004 that English and American critics are largely unaware of the work done by the French and Germans, and of course, you know, let alone any others than French and Germans, and continues with, Coelty's criticism is borne out in the numerous introductory studies to crime fiction that prioritize the Anglo-American canon and either ignore or treat non-Anglophone texts superficially. As telling example, King mentions Martin Priestman's well-known 2003 Cambridge Companion to crime fiction. However, as scholars of other literatures, for reasons I sketched earlier, have increasingly come to rely on the use of English as working language, for many, if not most, studies of non-Anglophone crime fiction, it still is the Anglo-American tradition that, in the guise of global standard, continues to serve as the inevitable tertium comparationis. One consequence of the present preeminence of the Anglo-American tradition is that it's habitually thought to be the very fountainhead of crime fiction. In reality, of course, pride of place has to go to some works in other European languages, possibly also non-European ones, with, for instance, some 18th century Chinese novels about the Tang Dynasty Judge Dee. But a lot of work in other European languages actually predates the earliest American or Anglo-American cases. Hoffmann's novella Das Fräulein von Scuderi, 1819, but especially Adolf Milner's Der Kaliber, 1828, are often cited as inaugurating the detective genre in German. The first detective novel in Danish, The Rector of Wilbu, by Steen Steensen Blicher, appeared in 1829, followed in 1839 by The Murder of Engine Maker Roelsen by Maurits Hansen. But of most consequence, undoubtedly, were the Mémoires de Vidocq, chef de la police de sûreté jusqu'en 1827, not a fiction, but a partially ghost-written biography of the one-time head of the French police and the first private detective in the world, published in 1828, which became immensely popular also in English translation in the 1830s, and which undoubtedly influenced the beginnings also of the Anglo-American tradition with Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue of 1841. Now, compared to the Anglo-American tradition, however, most other, at least European traditions, again with the exception of the French, until fairly recently enjoyed only a local or at best a limited international reach. This is not to say that some local European crime fiction was not very successful. Suffice it to mention Maj Sjöwall and Per Wohler's Martin Beck and Henning Mankel's Kurt Wallander novels in Sweden, Manuel Vázquez Montalbán's Pepe Caravaggio series in Spain, or Andrea Camilero's Inspector Montalbano novels in Italy. As far as television series are concerned, I distinctly remember seeing on Dutch and Flemish television, next to American and British series, with, in parentheses, Morse, my absolute favorite, some French maigresses, as well as some German television series, such as Derrick, Tatort, and Der Alte. The latter two series, which started airing in 1970 and 1977, respectively, are still running, albeit the cast of the series has changed a few times, but they no longer seem to be distributed beyond the German-speaking areas. And this undoubtedly has to do with the fact that from the early 2000s on, their place in the European television landscape has been usurped or taken over by newer productions, in first instance Scandinavian or Nordic Noir series such as Wallander, 2005-2013, Verbrydelsen, the Killing, 2007-12, and Bowen, the Bridge, 2011-2018. In fact, the expansion of the European television market as of the 1980s and 90s, with the proliferation of mostly commercial channels, the arrival of HBO on channel television as of the 1990s in selected European countries, and of American streaming services beginning with Netflix in Great Britain and Ireland in 2012, has significantly altered the entire media landscape in Europe. And of course, in what I'm saying, you'll be hearing a lot of echoes of Professor Dalasta's brief presentation earlier on, because obviously we're working not only in the same field, but on the same elements when we talk about crime fiction and crime series in Europe. For one thing, the change in the media landscape has greatly improved distribution possibilities also for non-Anglo, in the sense of being neither British or American produced, but also non-English spoken productions. And again, Scandinavian series driven by technical and thematic innovations, but also by smart marketing, paved the way. Now, capitalizing on the internationalization of crime movies and television series aired on regular broadcast channels, commercial or otherwise, and via cable channel and streaming services such as HBO, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney+, HBO Max, and the like, also the crime fiction market has expanded to the point where it can now legitimately be considered world literature. Indeed, of the latter, as David Damrosch posits in What is World Literature, is literature that circulates beyond its culture of origin, either in translation or in the original, works of crime fiction can certainly lay claim to making the grade, as there hardly is a genre that's more eagerly translated or that in its major language embodiments, and particularly so in English, sells more copies worldwide. Even writers in so-called minor languages or smaller literatures often sell in the millions. Take, for instance, the case of the Flemish, writing in Dutch, recently deceased detective fiction writer Peter Aspe. I bet he's totally unknown to most of you. Yet, his novels, featuring a Bruges trio of police detectives and a public prosecutor, have been translated into French, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, Czech, and Afrikaans, and since 2030 also into English, and they are marketed in the United States. And they've sold at least 1.5 million to 2 copies worldwide. Now, if this is the case for an otherwise, I think, totally unknown crime fiction writer from a small country and writing in a minor language, the tally for works in major languages and literatures such as French, German, Italian, and Spanish runs much higher in the original and in translation, and especially, of course, when translated into English. If there is no doubt then that over the past 2 or 3 decades, there has occurred an internationalization of the crime detective thriller market, particularly so when it comes to televised and streamed series, this seems to have been much less the case in scholarship on the genre. And of course, the tech precisely is doing something to change all that. King, in the article I already cited, admits that since the turn of the millennium, a growing number of book-length studies have appeared on crime narratives from countries around the world, and I add, including by members of DTECT and participants in the present conference. However, King also claims, despite undoubtedly expanding the parameters of mystery literature and developing greater awareness of the diverse practice of crime fiction globally, these studies have not been able to break the monopoly of the Anglo-American canon. This continues to sit front and center whereas the studies of national literatures are relegated to the margins with little critical engagement between the two. Moreover, he notes that even though there also have been a number of international and post-colonial collections on detective fiction, the majority of the chapters are limited to the national tradition to which the author or text belongs, be it Catalan or Canadian, Algerian or Argentine. I should add that King, who teaches at Monash University in Melbourne, is a specialist in Spanish and Catalan literature. Okay. In fact, King argues in some ways these very studies contribute to their own marginalization in crime fiction criticism by tending to limit their object of analysis to a specific national or regional literary tradition. These studies of national crime fiction reveal a pattern, or what Franco Moretti calls a law of literary evaluation, a law of literary evolution, by which the global genre becomes nationally bounded. This occurs through the focus on the progress towards the production of truly autochthonous crime narratives by writers in the specific national tradition on which the scholar works. In this pattern, analyses tend to begin with the translation of foreign, mainly Anglo-American and French, models, such as the novels and short stories of Poe, Conan Doyle, Christie, Hammett, Chandler, and Simenon, into the national language. The second phase, scholars identify and evaluate crime narratives by local writers in terms of the degree to which they are imitative of foreign models or contribute to the creation of national crime fiction. That's the end of the quote by King. Now, we may illustrate King's point by turning to Katharina Hall's 2016 edited volume on German crime fiction, one of a book series on European crime fiction published by Wales University Press, comprising, next to Hall's, also volumes on French, Scandinavian, Iberian, and Italian crime fiction. In her introduction, Hall argues that at first glance there may be few contemporary subgenres, such as the Regionalkrimi, the regional crime novel, or the Ökokrimi, ecological crime novels highlighting environmental concerns, that appear to be homegrown. But as this volume will show, German language crime writers have taken narrative forms from British, American, and European arenas and made them their own, refining and extending them in the context of their individual cultures and national concerns. For example, many German language crime narratives draw on long-standing traditions of political satire in magazines, cabaret, and literature, resulting in blackly humorous critiques of past and present society. This is a process of acculturation in its complex modern sense. And of course, along similar lines, there have appeared either monographs or collective volumes on almost each and every national literature, crime, detective, thriller, fiction, movie, and television series tradition. Now, given the internationalization, not to say globalization, of contemporary crime fiction, King, rather than a nation-by-nation approach, advocates a world literature approach, recognizing, with most scholars on the subject, the impossibility of taking on all of the world's literary production, even if only in one specific genre. King cites the Swedish comparative literature scholar Anders Pettersson, urging, quote unquote, literary scholars to overcome the risk of parochialism in a scholar's or critic's outlook and writings by bringing novels from different traditions together and getting them to speak to each other, and at times against each other. As an example, we might refer to an earlier volume in the Wales University Press series, Crime Fiction in the City, Capital Crimes, edited by Lucy Andrew and Catherine Phelps, 2013. Their volume reflects on the treatment of the capital city, a repository of authority, national identity, and culture within crime fiction, by looking at capital cities across Europe, from the more traditional centers of power, Paris, Rome, and London, to Europe's most northern capital, Stockholm, and also considers the newly devolved capitals Dublin, Edinburgh, and Cardiff. The book's avowed aim is to inaugurate a dialogue between Anglophone and European crime writing, and to explore the marginalized works of Irish and Welsh writers alongside established European crime writers. Interestingly, as an illustration of how quickly things change in crime fiction studies, Wales University Press, at least from what I could make out on the website, now no longer advertises Andrew and Phelps's volume along with Hall's and all other earlier volumes in the series, as well as the more recent contemporary French and Scandinavian crime fiction by Anne Grudeheu, under the heading European Crime Fictions, but as part of an ongoing series on international crime fictions. Now, picking up on David Damrosch's statement in What is World Literature, that one of the functions world literature may serve is that of a window on specific cultures and societies, King cites Anderson, Miranda, and Pizzotti's 2012 edited volume, The Foreign in International Crime Fiction, as proposing that the proliferation of crime novels around the globe means that crime fiction could be considered a new form of travel writing, albeit to places and situations the reader may never wish to experience firsthand. The latter might account for series set in out-of-the-way but picturesque places such as Shetland, or the western reaches of Iceland in Trapped, or yet the not-so-picturesque country backwaters of the Spanish Galician Os Abordas Margaridas, or the French La Forêt, set in the French-Belgian Ardennes border region. Andrew Pepper and David Schmidt, in their edited volume, Globalization and the State in Contemporary Crime Fiction, A World of Crime, cite Clive James in The New Yorker as commenting that in most of the crime novels coming out now, it's a matter not of what happens, but of where. Essentially, they are guidebooks. A study elaborating on such a guidebook approach is an article by Catherine Bengesser and Anna-Marie Toade, forthcoming in the European Review as part of the focus on European crime fiction generated from the Detect project on exploring Aarhus via crime narratives. And in that article, they present what they will also present in one of the seminar panels in the present conference, and I'll have occasion to come back to that European Review focus later on. Now, next to his windows on the world beyond the reader's immediate present environment, we could also think of crime fictions or series as windows on the past. And again, I mean, I'm here echoing now some of the things that Professor Dalasta has said. But I'm thinking, for instance, of recent television series such as Babylon Berlin or Peaky Blinders. Barbara Pizzotti, in her 2016 book on Italian crime fiction films and television series, argues that historical crime fiction has in fact developed into the fastest growing type of crime fiction, and that the success of crime narratives set in the near past speaks rather of the interest in making sense of the present by returning to its roots. Her book intends to examine the ways in which historical giallo novels, television series, and films have become a means to comment on and intervene in the social and political changes of the country. Now, if in Pizzotti's book, not surprisingly, the mafia takes pride of place, Dorota Skociarczak, in a 2000 article, focuses on how financial scandals and corruption during the post-World War II socialist era are exposed in contemporary Polish crime fiction. And in fact, and again in line with one of the things that Professor Dalasta mentioned earlier, Pizzotti and Skociarczak put their finger on the essential difference between British Golden Age and American hardboiled fiction and more recent European, but also much American crime fiction, but I would argue particularly recent European crime fiction. Almost concurrent with the earliest studies of crime fiction stressing the genre's formulaic character, expressive of conservative ideologies of the nation and an idealized never-has-been social order, the up-and-coming European practitioners of the genre realized its potential for critique and to work social and political changes. This was most obviously the case with the fiction of Sjöwall and Wahlöö in Sweden, who said that for their Martin Beck novels, the first of which appeared in 1965, they combined Simenon's psychological humane approach with social concerns, in their case, Marxist-inspired. But it also manifested with the French neo-polar, critiquing social and political corruption and focusing on the world of the socially marginalized and excluded. And of course, Mediterranean noir, as it was referred to by Professor Dalasta, perfectly plays into that purpose. It's no exaggeration to say that social critique, whether overt or underlying, today is the rule rather than the exception in European crime fiction, film, and television. This also gives a particularly European edge to many of the transnational phenomena that King holds up as fitting for a world literature approach to crime fiction. He mentions, for instance, how Katharina Hall, in an article preceding the book of hers I mentioned earlier, focuses on how crime novels in various languages engage with the aftermath of Nazism. And he notes how transitional justice in post-dictatorial societies is a leading topic in the Argentinian Eduardo Saqueri's La Pregunta de sus Ojos, later turned into Spanish language movie and also an American remake. But he also cites Spanish, Finnish, Estonian, and German examples. Now, both the legacies of dictatorial pasts and of fascism and Nazism offer abundant scope for a European approach. King himself, in yet another article, argues that in recent Catalonian crime fiction, among others by Vázquez Montalbán, the story of the crime doubles an underlying story having to do with Catalonia's past, and particularly the memory of the Spanish Civil War, but also reaching back further into Catalonia's repeated defeats and incorporations by Castile into a wider or greater Spain. In 1640, 1652, and 1714, as in 1939 with the victory of the Francoists. That such memory should be revived in the present is, given still ongoing events in Spain and Catalonia, surely not a coincidence. King also links violence to women to criminals linked to repressive centrist and historically Falangist regimes and institutions as expressive of overall suppression and repression. But similar reconstructions of repressive histories as the ultimate source of present-day crimes, but also of violence towards women, or including violence towards women, also happen in Nordic Noir, as for instance in Larsen's Millennium Trilogy, in the first part of which Lisbeth Salander is sexually abused by the man who is supposed to be her guardian for the law, and where the root of all crime is traced to an aristocratic entrepreneurial families sympathizing with Nazism during World War II. The legacy of Nazism also plays a determining role Donna Leon's debut novel, Death at La Fenice, in Robert C. Wilson's A Small Death in Lisbon, both of these date from 1992, and throughout the Bernie Gunter series, published between 1989 and 2019 of the late lamented Philip Carr. Leon, Wilson, and Carr, by the way, demonstrate that the writer does not necessarily have to have the nationality of the country whose society or history informs her or his fiction. Leon is American, but her commissario Guido Brunetti is a Venetian. Wilson is British, but his detective is Portuguese, and Carr was Scottish, but his hero is a German ex-police detective. Another world literary theme that can easily be linked to Europe's past is that of the legacy of colonialism. And this, of course, is one of the oldest themes in crime fiction, witness Collins's The Moonstone or Conan Doyle's The Sign of Four. But it's also still very much alive in contemporary European crime fiction, as in Didier Downings's Meurtre pour mémoire of 1983, which deals with the aftermath of the Algerian War of Independence. But think also of the Flemish television series Salamander, second series of which centers around African blood diamonds, and the first series of which detailed the existence of a Belgian secret organization run by members of the country's financial, political, and judicial elite going back to World War II and the days of the Belgian Congo. Salamander, by the way, has been broadcast around Europe via streaming and other television services in English adaptation. A more contemporary theme is that of continental migration, either because of political upheavals, such as the Balkan civil wars after the breakup of Yugoslavia, with Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians moving to Europe's northern countries, but also labor migration from East and Central Europe to Western Northern Europe, with arms trafficking, drugs, and human, especially women's trafficking, often for prostitution, as in Henning Mankell's Sidetracked of 1995. Again, the Flemish series Matrushkas, which under the title Sex Dolls and Sex Trade, again was aired internationally, features a group of Lithuanian women that via Cyprus are shipped to Antwerp, where they are put to work as prostitutes. And the murderers in Mankell's Faceless Killers of 1991 are Polish criminals illegally in Sweden. By the way, organized crime along ethnic lines is frequently featured in Swedish crime series. In Dossier K, 2002, the Flemish author Jeff Gerards pits his Antwerp detective duo against Albanese gangs. And a related yet even more contemporary theme is that of intercontinental migration in the form of political refugees and their involvement with crime, whether as subjects of human trafficking or as often involuntary participants in criminal activities. Such is the case, for instance, with a Syrian refugee in the Swedish-British television series Young Wallander, and with another Syrian refugee who turns police informant in the Flemish series The 13 Commandments, which again was aired internationally. The plight of refugees, especially as victims of human traffickers, has become one of the most common themes of contemporary European crime fiction. It also forms the subject of Donna Leon's latest novel, Transient Desires, of 2021, and in the Flemish-Dutch serial drama series Grensland. A number of these themes come together in the figure of an African girl that, upon making her way illegally to Europe, is forced into prostitution and drugs trafficking also. Obviously, following Andrew Pepper and David Schmidt's argument in the volume of theirs I cited earlier, we can see human trafficking, international drug trafficking, financial border crossing crimes, and many other kinds of crime as proof of the interconnectedness of the local and the global under the aegis of neoliberalism and globalization, where a crime, although perpetrated in a specific locale, is linked to a wider, often international, movements involving economic, social, and political developments, transcending not only the local, but also the nation. Now, while we can consider this in the broadest terms then as feeding into King's plea for crime fiction as world literature, I would argue that there's a stage at which these developments feed into an overarching, particularly European sensibility, and especially so since the proliferation of cable channel television in the 1990s, and even more since the arrival of streaming services in Europe, which I already referred to and which again Professor Dalasta referred to. But this at least is what I see emerging from the European review focus I mentioned earlier, and which results from work carried out under the aegis of Detect. For Federico Pagello, recent serial crime dramas such as La Casa de Papel, Subura, and Peaky Blinders have abandoned the classic formula of European crime TV series, usually focused on the figure of the detective and primarily addressed to a national audience. Instead, he argues, designed for an international market, these series provocatively concentrate on the figure of the criminal and adopt explicitly sensational aesthetics. And he also argues that this style and the bleak depiction of European society in these series are both an expression and a critical representation of the rise of populism on the old continent. Caius Dobrescu focuses on European governance via the British series Line of Duty. Jacques Migozzi, Natasha Leuven, and Lucia Mir discuss the internationalization of French noir fiction. Stefano Baschiera argues that European crime films usually don't make it outside their national circuit. He mentions In Bruges and Gomorrah, but obviously the same is not true for television series based on the same novels as are these films. These television series often turn into international successes throughout Europe when picked up, again, by streaming services. Now, the latter, that's to say the streaming services, are American, but perhaps paradoxically, they seem to help promote, of course, also in the interest of their own commercial success, forms of European or Europeanizing identities by multiplying these windows on other European societies referred to earlier, but also on pasts that often appear much more common than perhaps thought initially. Interestingly, and as already mentioned before, the more local the settings of such series, the greater their appeal seems to be also abroad. Kim Toft Hansen, Anna Kesek, and Sandor Kalai detail how HBO, since its arrival in Europe, has led to the increased production of original European crime drama series, which leads Belgian journalist Tom Heremans in the Flemish daily De Standaard, 10 April 2021, commenting on the announcement that Netflix, following the success of La Casa de Papel, Money Heist, is setting up a production hub for European series in Spain, to note, not without glee, that it is an American streaming provider that now teaches Europeans about their neighbors' countries and thus helps building a European identity. Ironically, this might even prove a remedy for the often touted complaint that the European project lacks a cultural dimension. Here again, then, a genre commercialized as popular entertainment might inadvertently serve ideological, nation, or union-building purposes. In fact, some international co-productions make a point of stressing how interconnected Europe is when it comes to crime. I'm thinking now specifically of The Team, co-production involving partners from Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland, with actors from all these countries collaborating on solving a string of international murders and using Danish, English, Dutch, French, German, and Swedish as working languages. From what I remember from the critique and the criticism of this particular series, which ran between 2015 and 2018, enthusiasm for the series was actually less than for a number of precisely, very specifically located local series. But serial drama adaptations of crime fiction in one country or language can also be co-produced, as for instance the Spanish, Italian, French Pepe Carvalho series after the novels of Vasquez Montalban, or think of the Danish, Swedish co-productions such as The Bridge, or the Dutch Flemish co-productions such as Grenslanders, which I mentioned before. All of these are situated on the border between the countries in question, yet they illustrate precisely that crime is without borders. Now, I want to close with highlighting a rather perhaps unexpected European turn in recent crime fiction. In the series named after him, Philip Carr's Bernie Gunther joins the Berlin police force in the late 1920s. When the Nazis come to power, Gunther refuses to play along. However, given his excellent reputation as a detective, and because prominent Nazis figure they can make good use of his services, he's forced to take an active part in some of the most significant events of the Nazi years. Because of this, he's prosecuted, blacklisted after World War II and prosecuted as a Nazi sympathizer, or at least suspected of being a Nazi sympathizer. He escapes under various aliases to Argentina, then Cuba, and finally makes it back to first France and then Germany. The entire series thus offers a fascinating picture of some 30 years of European and indeed world history, and it does so precisely from the perspective of this aftermath of Nazism approach that King and also Katharina Hall advocated. Still, the novels that particularly interest me here are Greeks Bearing Gifts and Metropolis, covering the end and the beginning of Gunther's career as a detective, whether official or unofficial. They are also the last two novels published in the series in 2018 and 2019, respectively. And this is not irrelevant, I think, as they both clearly are meant to draw parallels between two moments of crisis in Europe. Greeks Bearing Gifts is situated in 1957, with Gunther, under yet another alias, investigating a shipping insurance scheme in Greece that ultimately is linked to World War II, but which throughout the novel references to the creation, also in 1957, of the European Economic Community. And it also hints at the activities of the European Troika in Greece after the fallout of the financial crisis of 2008, and the role played by Germany in this. Timeo Danaos and Dona Ferentes is here ironically turned against the Greeks, who in Carr's novel stand in for Virgil's Trojans, while the Germans take on the role of the Latin poets Greeks. Metropolis suggests parallels between the financial crisis of the 1920s and the rise of Nazism and the rise of populism in the aftermath of the more recent financial crisis in Europe. From a very different perspective, the ideal of Europe also surfaces in some recent British thrillers. Jean le Carré's A Legacy of Spies, published in 2018, has British secret agents George Smiley and Peter Gwilym look back upon what happened in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the novel in which le Carré first gained fame in 1963. Gwilym now lives in France, Smiley lives in Germany. Reflecting upon why they did what they did as spies, Smiley muses whether it was all for England. But whose England, he asks? Which England? England all alone? A citizen of nowhere? I'm a European, Peter. If I had a mission, if I was ever aware of one beyond our business with the enemy, it was to Europe. A more recent recruit to the thriller author guild, Mick Herron, writing about an obscure counterintelligence branch in the novel London Rules, dated 2018 again. And of course, it's no coincidence that all of these novels, by British authors, are dated, at least must have been started writing immediately after Brexit, after the decision on the Brexit. Okay, but so Mick Herron in London Rules brings in a populist demagogue responsible for Britain's Brexit, and his 2021 novel Slow House once more prominently features Brexit. Now, all these recent fictions, like the serial crime dramas discussed, drive home the incontrovertible truth that all European countries, whether they like it or not, are inextricably locked into a larger European community, itself inalienably part of a world that is ever more globally connected. A fitting label for these most recent European crime novels, films, serial dramas, rather than global in King's World Literature view, or strictly local from a national perspective, might be, what I then like to call Euro-global. Like British Golden Age and American hard-boiled fiction, contemporary European crime fiction and serial drama give out an ideologically laden message, only this time one very different from that of their Anglo-American predecessors. Might we venture to say that these recent European crime fiction and drama series argue not only for diversity in unity, or unity in diversity, but even for ever closer union? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theo. I don't know if my camera is working. Yes, there we go.
Yes.
I'm so sorry about my technical kind of issues earlier, and thank you so much, Valentina, for stepping in so well to to introduce kind of Theo's talk. Theo, you've taken us on quite a journey there, from S Eliot to Philip Kern, from the Maltese Falcon to Berlin, Babylon, Berlin. And from one TV channel to streaming services across multiple platforms. And the challenge you've set us to think about the Anglosphere, or to think beyond the Anglosphere, and perhaps more importantly, the tendency to see or understand crime fiction through the prism of national traditions, and to engage in the kind of comparativist and transnational work that King identifies, and that's at the heart of your own work on world literature, is something that many of us working on the Detect project are seeking to put into practice. To think about text as not belonging to particular countries, to Denmark or France or Spain, but some kind of larger regional, whether this is Nordic or Mediterranean noir, continental, Europe perhaps, or even global configurations. So what do we mean when we talk about European crime fiction? Is it possible to do so outside or beyond the political frameworks of convergence and divergence, or your provocative comment then about ever closer union? What other Europes exist that crime fiction particularly is best equipped to locate and interrogate? A focus on Europe may be a way of avoiding the problems of over-identifying crime fiction with national particularities and of going global too quickly, to paraphrase your old friend and co-editor David Damrosch, and of being confronted by a field of infinite textual multiplicity. Certainly your stories of crime fiction's dismissal by orthodox literary scholars strikes a chord with many of us, but as these elitist fantasies are swept away by the vigor and multiplicity of our scholarship, the challenge of how to connect individual stories to larger systems, social, political, and economic, that shape these narratives remain a pressing one. Because let's face it, a novel like Simenon's Coupe de Lune, a crime novel of sorts, has a good deal more to say about, kind of colonial exploitation than Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And in response to your illuminating talk, kind of throw a question back at you. What kind of political or critical work can we expect crime fiction to perform? We often hear it said at conferences like this one that crime fiction is the most political of all genres, or as you say, a vehicle for socio-political critique. But sort of, kind of perhaps we might think about sort of, offering greater specificity in terms of what this means. To answer this question, I think requires us to move deftly between the various forms that you talk so well about and the various registers that you kind of so tellingly pinpoint. Representation, of course, but also production and reception. to think about how and why and where these narratives are circulating and what meanings readers and audiences attach to them. You're absolutely right, I think, to be suspicious about this analogy between crime fiction and travel or tourism, even if crime fiction is undoubtedly a driver of tourism in ways that some at this conference will discuss. Because the Europe that's waiting for us to unearth, that is being dug up by its writers, is in some ways, you know, kind of a horror show, despite these new transcultural identities that are kind of emerging. There may be positive stories of humanitarianism and cultural mixing, but our continent's history is soaked in blood, and our past and present are characterized by endemic racism, misogyny, xenophobia, exploitation, and capital riding roughshod over everything. Perhaps the political work then that crime fiction does best is not exemplifying this from afar, so to speak, showing us the nastiness, to quote Philip Marlowe, at a distance, so we can tut and blame others, but rather to explore the various ways we are complicit in perpetrating these crimes and the systems that produce them, to make us see and understand this complicity, to see the ways in which we're stuck, to see all of this in Bron or Camilleri or Le Carré, and to understand the causes and consequences before we're able to think about some kind of larger transformation. So there we go. There's just a sort of, kind of a few kind of, thoughts on, kind of what was a, kind of a really kind of, rich and kind of brilliant talk. And I wondered sort of, kind of perhaps first, maybe you could say something a little bit more about, this tension on the one hand between kind of crime fiction that, kind of shines a light on the kind of, sort of the dark side of European integration, the networks of kind of criminality and trafficking and drugs and so on. And on the other hand, this sort of more hopeful move towards sort of cooperation and, kind of union in a sense that sort of, kind of is also a part of these, kind of, new productions as well. How do we kind of hold these two things, kind of together?
Yeah, thank you for the remarks and for the question. The funny thing is, of course, that the dark sides you talk about, especially, the internationalization of crime, is brought home on the very local level by many of these crime fictions. I mean, Nesting and in your own collection, you edited with Schmidt, insists on precisely this aspect of Henning Mankel's fiction, namely that he shows how the most international of crimes work out on the local level, so to speak. And I think that's what happens in quite a lot of both fictions and series around Europe. So in that sense, I think the more local, the more people become aware of the fact that even on the very lowest local level, so to speak, there is no escape from the international aspect of crime. At the same time, what you find in a number of these fictions and series, and I'm thinking now specifically of Shetland, for instance, is that there is no solution to the local crime without international collaboration. In Shetland, I distinctly remember in a couple of the installments, he has to call in the help of a Norwegian detective. I'm thinking of another series, I don't remember which one, but in which collaboration is necessary between Dutch and Danish police officers, for instance. And I think you see this more and more, just not just the internationalization of crime, but also the internationalization, if you want to, of the police work, which is one of the things that ties together Europe. Now, if you ask what political role or socio-political role this might play, well, there I do see a parallel, for instance, with that Golden Age or American hardboiled fiction, in the sense that, as I indicated, its appeal to feelings of nationalism, if you want to, even of racism and all the rest, was often subliminal. I mean, obviously people read these novels for the entertainment. Yeah. And I think the same thing is true with these series. I think a lot of people watched Casa de Papel, for instance, because it was an entertaining series. You know, you never knew beforehand what was going to happen. It was unusual, etc. The message was pretty obvious too, I think. I mean, it was obviously anarchic, etc., etc., even though finally they were doing it for the money. But you know, there's a message that is being given along with the entertainment, and I think that is the strength precisely of specifically the crime genre, that it's able to do that. And of course that involves both critique, if you want to, of what is wrong with Europe. I mean, that was the initial idea of Schowal and Wilder, of course, and to a certain extent, although I'm not sure whether it was deliberately so, what shines through in some of Simenon's novels. But I think with many authors of crime fiction, certainly I think with people like Carr and all the rest, it's very deliberate, you know, that they do this, that they show that crime in whatever sense, past and present, is not just a haphazard thing that happens in one particular place, but that it's in many ways connected to many other things. And there again, and I think also commerce comes in here, okay, with the streaming services and all the rest. It's always a give and take, I think, between what can you bring, what sells, what do people want to watch, you know, what is the return that is expected of these series in order to keep producing them. And in that respect, I think it's very interesting that it's precisely these American streaming services that now seem to be assuring the success, and actually even themselves producing or encouraging the production of European-made series that have more than local appeal, because obviously, I mean, any national market in Europe, I think, is no longer big enough to warrant the outlay necessary to make a really brilliant, innovative, etc. series. Maybe that was still possible in the early 2000s when Nordic Noir started, and I think with Nordic Noir, there was definitely, it was a marketing strategy and all the rest that was behind it, taking its cue from existing fiction, but also adding to it. But now it's obvious, I think, that if you really want to be successful, you have to produce things that appeal to a much wider audience than just a national one. And then Europe, as a community, serves both as possibility and as limitation, if you want to. Yeah.
You sort of said quite, you know, I mean, a really interesting sort of comment in the middle part of the paper, which I was listening to all despite the sort of technical problems, that there's something, you know, kind of looking at kind of Europe and European crime narratives now in relation to, say, American or kind of UK ones. There is that sort of, you know, greater potential for this kind of critique that we're talking about. And, you know, I wonder if that's tied to both to, you know, the kind of production question that you're kind of raising, but also the kind of audience ones. You know, I wonder whether kind of European audiences are sort of, you know, perhaps, you know, kind of wanting this kind of critique, wanting to see it. And, you know, kind of, you know, obviously one can't generalize, you know, kind of across sort of, you know, kind of nations and continents, but, you know, kind of bring their own kind of critical framework that they expect to be in these kind of series themselves.
I think so. I think more and more, at least, but I mean, obviously I'm arguing now from, or reasoning from, an individual point of view. I can't speak for all 500 million Europeans, obviously, but I certainly want to see more. I'm interested in the exotic locales, but I'm also interested in how these things hang together, you know, just, and how, I mean, it's no longer just a crime of passion that is committed in a Paris suburb, for instance. I'm sure there's still novels written like that. I'm sure there's still series and films made like that, and they'll probably continue to be made, and they'll continue to find an audience. But that, I think, is not where we're at, you know, where we're talking about, let's say, the cutting edge of what we're talking about. I think it is this internationalization. And of course, that's not just the case in in crime fiction. I think that's the case in everything, and you see the same problems cropping up in crime fiction, or the same ideas somewhere else. I was thinking, for instance, talking about Brexit and all the rest, of Jonathan Coe's Middle England, for instance, which basically deals with the same thing, or with legitimate, serious literature authors that now increasingly also turn to crime fiction to make their points. I was thinking of Snow by, Irish writer, the best-known Irish novelist at the moment. You tell me.
Was that Andrew?
No. Well, anyway, the guy of Birchwood and all.
I should know this, shouldn't I? But
so should I. But I mean, it escapes me. William Boyd, for instance, also has increasingly turned to crime fiction, and I think it's because these people want to say something. They want to say something to a wider audience than the one they are reaching with the serious literature, so to speak. And they find that the best way of doing that is to do it via crime fiction. By the way, I think that, I've been talking about Anglo-American, etc. a lot, but I think there's a clear distinction now between American crime fiction and English or British crime fiction. And I think British crime fiction, whether Brits like it or not, these days tends to be much more like European crime fiction than like American crime fiction. So in that sense, I think Brexit has not been the solution, if you want to.
And it's tied sort of, kind of British or UK writing much more closely to sort of its European counterparts.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, which is fascinating, and it's sort of kind of a part of the kind of wider Detect project, I think, certainly. Right. And sort of kind of then America is sort of kind of off, kind of off stage, so to speak. Right. Kind of still a kind of influence, but sort of perhaps not to the extent that it was.
No, and I think there the special relationship no longer pertains. I was also thinking, it's about one of the things you said and how the internationalization sort of shines through. Again, this series Shetland, I think it's of course it's after a series of books by a British female author, who, and the books were popular before the series, but still, it's no coincidence, I think, that the detective has a Spanish name, Perez, This in Shetland, this is about the furthest you can go from the center, so to speak, and yet even there, it's no longer British. It's
part of the North in that sense. No, I'm wondering whether there are going to be questions. I'm sure there are questions. I'm just trying to sort of figure out how I, kind of work out, sort of, how to sort of see the questions.
Get into the chat message on the right-hand top of your screen. Yeah, there's a red button flashing, and the questions, it should be there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't see that.
No,
I'm afraid.
It only says we remind you that to ask questions you can use this chat or raise your hand. But
yes, I'm sort of just we can carry on sort of kind of chatting, but
it would be interesting to have more questions, and the views of other.
Sort of, I don't know if we can get some help from anyone else here in terms of being able to kind of see questions or kind of invite, kind of audience members to actually ask them. I don't know whether that's possible.
I was hoping to ask a question, but I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes.
I've also written it there, but it's grayed out, so I don't know if you can see it. I don't know whether you can see, my name is Nicoletta Di Ciolla from the Manchester Metropolitan University. I work on Italian crime fiction. I found your comments about the use of a European, or the hope that European crime fiction could actually lead to not integration, but communication and wider lines of communication amongst European countries and European people. I was wondering whether, and that's the question I typed in there, whether when it comes to series, audiences do not expect to see the same stereotypes or familiar aspects of a country represented, revisited on screen, instead of perhaps more imaginative and inventive and perhaps more contemporary and authentic elements and aspects of the country. My example is Montalbano, which in the UK is shown every Saturday night or very regularly. But the Montalbano stories, be it because Camilleri was who he was, but the adaptation seemed to indulge in this view on the aesthetics of the characters, on the love story always lurking beneath any kind of crime plot or element. So it's like Italian crime fiction shown on television cannot veer away from the familiar stereotypes that the public expects. Whereas, for example, the great innovation of the Scandi noir, was that he was presenting to European audiences something that was hitherto unknown to them or very unfamiliar, and therefore these authors and the screenwriters, the people who are doing the adaptations, had more free reign. So I was wondering, are we tied to the stereotype of the familiar? To what extent can crime fiction from Italy or even France aspire to be innovative and imaginative and ambitious and steer away from stereotypes?
Yeah, I would admit that's a trap. I was just thinking that I've been watching Subura over the last couple of weeks, and of course that in many ways is very stereotypical Italian. You know, it's what you expect it to be like, with the corrupt church officials, with the mafia, with just everything like that, and undoubtedly Nordic Noir could be innovative and therefore I think also push